We still have some participants coming in, but I think we might get started tonight. Thank you very much for attending. My name is Julia Franco. I'm the Biodiversity Officer at Nillumbik Shire Council, and I'd like to welcome you this evening to our Kangaroo webinar. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting, and I would like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and future, and to the elders of other communities who may be participating this evening. Before we get started with the presentation tonight, I just want to discuss a bit of housekeeping. If you have any questions during the presentation, I'd like you to just click on the little Q&A button which is down on the bottom of your screen. And then at the end of Graeme Coulson's presentation, we'll be asking him those questions and hopefully getting some answers for you. We may not get around to all of them tonight, but we'll do our very best. So yeah, if you've got any questions, please type them down in the box at the bottom, and please ask that your questions also be very respectful tonight. We understand that discussions on kangaroos can be quite emotive, so we just want to make sure that whatever is discussed in tonight's webinar is very respectful to others. So yeah, please keep that in mind. There's also a function in the Q&A to upvote the questions that are being asked. So please click on the thumbs up for any questions that you see in that you want to be answered, and we'll make sure that they get answered as a priority. And then also that way the questions won't be doubled up either. So tonight, the intention of the webinar is to understand the biology and population dynamics of kangaroos. We are using this webinar as a way to educate and inform not just Nillumbik residents, but us at Council as well on one of the most common species in Nillumbik. The aim is to learn about how kangaroos use their habitat and their foraging behaviour, some discussion on population dynamics, including how they naturally regulate their own population sizes, and the reasons why populations become large or imbalanced. Firstly though, I want to make it clear upfront that we do not intend to use this webinar as a comprehensive discussion on culling or any discussion on the authorities to control wildlife. However, no doubt there will be questions around culling because this is an important part of the conversation. Nor do we intend on using this webinar tonight to form a position on culling in kangaroos in Nillumbik. As you may or may not be aware, the management of kangaroo culls sits with the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning, and it is not something that we can inform or regulate. So I think we'll get started with the presentation. I would like to introduce Graeme Coulson, who is an Honorary Principal Fellow in the School of Biosciences at the University of Melbourne. He first trained in psychology and later joined the Department of Zoology at the University of Melbourne, where he taught undergraduate and postgraduate subjects and supervised 58 honours, 10 masters and 26 PhD students. He has published over 150 scientific articles and has presented over 100 talks at scientific meetings. His research is field-based, melding behavioural ecology with conservation biology in a range of wildlife species, particularly macropods, kangaroos and wallabies, as well as wombats, bandicoots, bats, deer, gulls and legless lizards. He is currently a member of 10 advisory bodies and recovery teams, seeking to integrate high-quality science into the effective management of wildlife. Tonight, Graeme is going to talk about the biology, population dynamics of kangaroos. Over to you, Graeme.
Well, thank you for that introduction, Julia. I'll be working off my slides for most of the time, but I might just pop back in at intervals if I need to wave my arms around to make a point. But most of the time I'll be using the cursor on the screen, so you'll have to keep an eye on that as we go. I'll share my screen now. and we'll get started. There we go. And as Julia said, the title of this webinar is Biology and Population Dynamics of Kangaroos. And to kick it off, that photo shows at least 250 kangaroos in a paddock. I once spent a lot of time blowing the photo up and counting very laboriously. I got slightly different numbers each time, but there are at least 250 there. And the approach I'm going to take is mostly around the population dynamics. So there will be other bits of biology, but I'm taking a population focus to this. And that means that some things won't get much coverage, but we can ask about those later if you want to. So I'll start off with some really fundamental points so that we're all on the same page. And the first of these is simply, what is a biological population? And it's very much the same as population used in a human context, except we're dealing with a range of species. So our first step is to define the species we're interested in. And in this case, it's the eastern grey kangaroo, which is the, as Julia said, a very, very common species in Nillumbik and in Victoria generally. The second part of a population definition is the place that you're interested in. And this is where it gets a bit tricky. So the place could be Australia, and you could ask about the population of kangaroos in Australia. It could be Victoria, it could be Nillumbik, it could be a whole lot narrower. So it matters where you're talking about. It's a question of scale. A very large area, you'd have a very large number of individuals in it, but that wouldn't particularly help you much if you were managing a small reserve somewhere in the Shire. So defining your place is quite important, and we'll be talking about what goes on within that place as we go through the presentation. And the third component is about time. So this really recognises that populations don't stand still in time either. So they might move around from one place to another, or the individuals might, and the population will change over time. And it's that time component that is really the dynamic part. So what happens over time, and that really means we have to define the time that we're interested in too. So is it next week? Is it 10 years ago? Is it the interval between 2000 and 2020? They're the sort of descriptors we have to put around our definition of the population we're interested in. And that will depend entirely who you are and what you're doing, whether you're talking a small place in just a short time, or a very large area, perhaps over a longer period of time, or any combination of those. The other thing I wanted to cover at the start is to get some idea of how we work out population size, because it's all about numbers, but how do we get those numbers and what sort of numbers are they? The first one of those ones on the list, absolute abundance, is more or less what it sounds like. It is an absolute number. So this is our best understanding of the population. It would be a number like 2,753 kangaroos, very precise. Really with no guesswork around it, it's a figure that we know exactly. The unfortunate thing, of course, is we hardly ever do. There are very few situations where we can know exactly what the absolute abundance is. So to get around that, we drop down one point there and we start to think about population estimates. And an estimate is designed to come up with a number, but it recognises that it is never going to be an absolute figure. It's based on a sampling procedure of some sort. So you're taking little samples of a population and you generally extrapolate or scale up from that to work out what your population might be. And I say might because an estimate will always have variance or error around it. So it'll be 2,375 kangaroos plus or minus 125 is the sort of estimate you might end up with. Or you can express the estimate as a percentage. So you've got 2,375 kangaroos plus or minus 10% might be another way to view it. And it's always telling you that you don't know for sure. You've got some bounds, some variation around your estimate. So you'd hope it was right, but it's probably not going to be right most of the time. And the third one down there is what we're often having to do because we can't even provide an estimate sometimes. And this is simply called an index. And a population index is a measure that is related to abundance in some way, but it's not directly related. So we're not really sure what the link is between our index and the population size that we're trying to guess at. An example might be the number of holes under a fence along beside a patch of bush and a paddock of juicy pasture. Now, intuitively, the more holes there are, probably the more kangaroos there are around that have been making those holes. But it's only an indicator of some general idea of abundance. You certainly couldn't turn it into a number. But you can still use indices, with the plural of index, in a comparative way. So you can say, this place has more fence holes than this other place. So there's probably more kangaroos in the first one than there are in the second one. Or we now have 10 times as many fence holes as we did last decade. So there's been a change over time. So those sort of estimates can be very useful. They can be simply as simple as something as just the number of kangaroos you've seen on your way home. So if you drive home roughly the same time every night, you might use that as an index and say, well, I'm now seeing 3 times as many more as I did 5 years ago. Or I've driven this same stretch for 5 years and now I'm seeing a lot less than I used to. That's an index of a sort. It's telling you something about population size. And as I'm saying that, you're probably immediately thinking, yeah, but there's a whole lot of other things that might affect how many kangaroos you're going to see from your car each evening on your way home, or how many holes there might be in a fence. And you're absolutely right, and that's why an index is only just a reasonable go at the question of how many. It's never as good as an estimate, and an estimate is never as good as absolute abundance. But sometimes that's the best we can do. So that's a few basics about populations, and I wanted to have a look at how we might measure these things with kangaroos, and we'll start with absolute abundance. And there's actually 3 main methods. There are others, but I'll show you the 3 main ones first of all. First one's called a sweep count, and I'll explain how that works in a minute. Second one's distance sampling, which is a bit more complicated, and I'll take you through that. And the third one probably makes more sense, a fecal pellet count, and I'll explain how that can give you some kangaroo numbers too. So we'll have a look at the sweep count first of all, and here's an example from a little reserve not far from Nillumbik Shire. It's near Healesville, and we've got Ranger Paul here explaining to a group of volunteers about how this sweep count is going to work. The reserve, you can see up on the map here, it's actually got a fence all the way around it. So this is an enclosed population of kangaroos. They can't get in or out. And the idea of a sweep count is you line people up, and I'll just get the cursor back, hope everybody can see that. You line people up right at one end of the reserve, and you line them in a way that every person can see the people either side of them. And then slowly, without making a lot of noise, people progress, lost my cursor, move slowly down through the reserve until they get to the far end. And if everybody keeps in line and everybody follows the rule of being able to see the person to their left and to their right, then any kangaroos in that reserve will be encountered by the line. And the idea is not to actually sweep them all to the end so that they get terrified down about where Paul's hand is. The idea is actually to let the kangaroos back through the line as you move down through the map. And by doing that, all you then have to do is count the numbers that have passed back through the line. And most sweep counts have a rule that says something like, you only count the kangaroos on your left and then that takes away any risk of double counting. So by the time everybody's got to the bottom of the map, all the kangaroos should have gone back through the line, and you simply add up everybody's little piece of paper or the numbers on their phones, and you will have an absolute abundance. You will know very precisely how many kangaroos there are in that reserve. And that sort of approach has been used a lot in places where the area is small and where it has definite boundaries. So in a couple of cases, it's been done on islands, which are ideal, of course, because the kangaroos can't get away. They're going to stay on the island. And also in these reserves that have fences around them. It works quite well. The things that can go wrong is mostly to do with the people and the communication between them. So it's very easy to develop a little gap in the line. Kangaroos will go back through and you won't know. Or sometimes the line just gets really wonky, so some people get further out ahead of where they should be. And to counteract that, many of these sweep counts have areas where people reform the line. So here's one across here, that's a track, and people, whoops, people all are supposed to reach that track at about the same time. They line up along the track again, reform the line, make sure they're all spread out, and then continue on to the next track further south. And so it goes. So it's a very good technique if everything's well coordinated and if the situation is suited to it and generally fairly small and enclosed in some way. So that's our sweep count. And as I say, if it's done well, it will give you absolute abundance. So you will know exactly how many kangaroos there are in that reserve. In larger places that don't have nice, neat boundaries, we often use what's called distance sampling. And the sampling gives you a clue that this is an estimate because you're going to walk down a sample line or a series of sample lines. And distance is the measurement that is the key to the whole process. So Ruth here is doing a kangaroo survey down at Wilson's Prom. I know she's looking through the binoculars. She's actually looking way over here somewhere. She's already seen these ones, don't worry. They've already been counted. She's looking at a group of roos much further away. And what she's doing is spotting a group of roos at a distance. She uses the binoculars just to check how many there are. And then she takes two critical measurements. Hanging around her neck is this thing. It's a laser rangefinder. So she measures the distance to the roos, so they might be over here somewhere. And she's also got a compass hanging around the neck, and she's going to measure the bearing to the roos over there. Now she's walking down a fixed straight line. She knows exactly what her bearing is as she walks along, and she can then convert her distance measurements to what's down on the bottom of this graph here, which is the perpendicular distance from the line. So this is the right angle distance away from the line. And these columns of data are her data showing the proportion of animals that she saw at each of these distances. So it might be a bit hard to see, but it goes out to about 160 metres. And then with some rather fancy mathematical modelling, you derive this red curve, and that's called the detection function. And this is the key to everything because that's telling you how much detectability of the kangaroos changes over distance. And it's completely intuitive. If the kangaroos are right on the line, you will always see them. The further and further away they are, the less and less likely you are to see them. And eventually you chop it off. In this case, it's been chopped off at about 160 metres, as I said. You could go further and further out, but you'll see less and less kangaroos, so there's not much point. And then what the program does is, having figured out the shape of this line, it then works out that underneath the line are all the ones you've actually seen, and what it works out is the proportion of ones up above the line, which are the ones you didn't see. You know how wide the line is, you know how long the line is, and you can work out the area that you've been sampling, and you can work out how many kangaroos there were in that area, which gives you a figure for their density, which would be expressed in kangaroos per hectare. So that's a really powerful tool. It's used a lot It's very good in open country like this. And it has a few limitations, as all methods do, but it generally works pretty well. Once you get into thicker vegetation, though, you can't do it because you make so much noise moving through the plants that you just scare the kangaroos away. And of course, you can't see most of them anyway because it's too dense. So then we often use a fecal pellet count. And here, Mel is walking around in circles. This is not very dense vegetation. As you can see, it's nice and open, so it makes it a bit easy to imagine. And she's holding a piece of string which is almost 4 meters long. It's anchored to this peg in the middle here. And she's going to go round and round in circles, coming in about 1 hand span each time. And her goal is to sweep out a complete circle that works out to be 50 square meters in area. And all the way around, she's spotting kangaroo poo, picking them up and throwing them out of the circle. So she's only measuring newly deposited, new fresh poo, because a month earlier, she had cleared out these plots again. So we're just looking at what's been landed on the plot in that time. Now, it takes a while to do 50 square meters, going round and round on your piece of string, working your way into the middle. And she's got another 149 of these to go. So you need a fair bit of data, but as you can see, any pellets down there would be pretty easy to spot. Now, there's a couple of ways you can use this information. You could just say, well, if we get a lot of pellets this month, that probably means there are a lot of kangaroos. That would be an index. And you could compare it with last month or last year or another site and say, this one has more pellets per square metre than another one, so we've probably got a higher density here. But with fecal pellets, you can go one better. And that is if you can determine the pellet output rate. And here is one of our kangaroos down at Anglesea. This is Rolf, and he is about to produce gold. We've got a pellet group from Rolf there. Somebody, a couple of people in the University of New England up in New South Wales have followed kangaroos for 24 hours a day for a number of weeks to measure exactly how many pellets they produce per day in 24 hours. This would be a good one to have a chat on, but we haven't got time. How many do you reckon? 100, 200? Nope. It's almost 500 per day, 493 pellets on average by an eastern grey kangaroo. So let's put those two bits of information together. We've now measured how many pellets were dropped on that 50 square metre plot that Mel was measuring before in a month. So we know the time that it's taken, we know the size of the plot, and we now know the output rate of the kangaroo. So you can then put those two lots of numbers together and estimate the density of kangaroos using the pellet technique. So it goes one better than an index if you've got a good pellet output rate, which we do for eastern greys. A lot of other species we don't, so we can't do it. But it does give us a very handy figure, and it's particularly useful in areas that are too dense to measure using distance sampling, or too big or too open to measure with a sweep count. So it's a very handy method. All right, I'm going to look at some fundamentals of population dynamics now, and I'll be using this equation a number of times. For those who hate maths, it's no big deal. It's actually really simple, and it's completely common sense. The n is the number, so this is our population size. So the number we have now, whenever now is, let's say today, is equal to the number we had then, and that might have been, say, a month ago, plus the number of births, little legends down here if you forget, the number of births that have been brought into this population, minus the number of deaths from the number of individuals that have been taken out of the population by death, plus the number of immigrants, the ones that have migrated inwards to the population, and minus the number of emigrants, the ones who have left the population but simply by going somewhere else. And that is the fundamental equation for population dynamics for any plant or animal you're looking at. They all have the same basic idea. And what I'm going to do is just break that down a bit and work through some of the components for eastern grey kangaroos. So we'll forget about the immigration and emigration for a minute. We'll come back to that later, and we'll concentrate on births and deaths. So births, first of all, it's really misleading putting these twins up here. These are very new twins. They're probably only a couple of days old, and twins are really, really rare in eastern greys. Only about 1% of births are twins. And even when twins are produced, they never make it through so that both of them get to the end of their pouch life. Something goes wrong for one or the other along the way. So we hardly ever see big twins, but occasionally you'll see little twins like this. You can see that each one of these is attached to a small teat. So this one's got its own teat, and it's going to use that teat for the rest of its life with its mother. And this little one is attached to another teat, which it's going to use for the rest of its life with the mother. Over here is a giant teat underneath a very large mammary gland, which is supporting the older brother or sister of these little twins. So what we've got is a bit like a conveyor belt system, but at any one time you can have, well, in this case, two young in the pouch, usually one young in the pouch, almost always one young in the pouch, and another one outside that pops its head back in to suckle from the teat that it used to be attached to when it was a little baby, but now it just pops its head back in from time to time. You can see from the graph down the bottom here, this is the month distribution of births, and this is from just outside Nillumbik over at Yan Yean, and the majority of births in that population were in January, fairly early January, but there are births spread almost through the year, but there's a definite peak around November, December, January. So we're dealing with a spring, summer peak, and these little guys have taken over a month in pregnancy to get to the stage of being born. They're going to spend almost 11 months in the pouch, and the result of all that is that there is only one young produced per year. There is the conveyor belt system, as I said, so this one attached to the who's using this other teat has already left the pouch, but you can't do any better than one young per year with eastern greys. So people often talk about kangaroos breeding like rabbits. They certainly don't. They don't even breed like sheep. If you've got a breed that's twinning, they can produce at the maximum one young per year, and they peak around this time of year, as you can see in the graph. So there'll be most births in about a span of those 3 months, November, December, January. Now, birth in kangaroos is one important step, obviously, but when we're thinking at a population level, the birth that's perhaps more interesting to us because we now can count it is when this little guy actually starts to leave the pouch and is ready to leave the pouch permanently. And that happens at about 11 months of age. So at that point, we've gone from that tiny little pink bean, which only weighed about 1 gram, to up to about 4 or 5 kilos, this little guy. And it's now, we call, entered the population. So it's now something we would count in the survey. It's something we would then monitor. And it's not exactly a fully fledged member of the population yet, but it's certainly in there. So I've got a birth in inverted commas there to get the idea across that now this really has become part of that equation where we've got our B for birth. This little guy really has joined the population. The flip side of the births, the one that subtracts individuals from the population, is death. And there are a number of ways you can measure this. The most valuable way is to tag individuals and follow them through their lives. So this female is Marilyn. She's got her collar and her ear tags, so we know who she is. And this is her little son, Mark. And we can, by tagging the young at that stage, we can follow them through their lives. Eventually he'll get big enough to get a collar if he lives that long. Many little kangaroos like this don't survive. They have all sorts of things that can go wrong, and I'll talk about some of those later. But the way to find out their lifespan, their longevity, and some idea of their survival pattern is some long-term marking program like this. But as I said, that's a very challenging thing to do. You have to catch them and you have to maintain a monitoring program. You've got to spend a lot of time watching out for them, and you can't do that in every population, obviously. So an alternative is to work backwards and to work from the animals that have died. So here's the skull of an eastern grey kangaroo, and it can tell us the age the kangaroo died at. So this gives us another way of looking at longevity. Rather than following an individual through its life until it dies, we can collect the skulls of animals that have died and work backwards to when they were born. And we can do this because of these molar teeth down here, which have a process called molar progression. And it's a way that the kangaroos use to counteract the very abrasive effect of their diet. So they're eating a lot of grass. Grass contains a lot of silicon, which is just like little bits of glass, and they wear down the teeth very quickly. So you can see these teeth here and here. These are the ones that are doing a lot of chewing, and they're just about worn down flat, and pretty soon they'll be useless. So what the kangaroos do is have a system of tooth replacement, so that in fact, whoops, there we go, that tooth there actually started out back here and has slowly moved forward in the jaw to the point where it's just about to fall out. Sorry. Now that process takes place at a specific rate. So by working out which tooth is which and knowing the rate of progression moving forward, we can calculate the age of this kangaroo. Well, any kangaroo. So in this particular case, this is its last molar here. This is molar 4. And by looking at some markers on the bone, we can work out its age, and it turns out to be just under 8 years old. So this one was almost 8 when it died. And that's actually a fairly typical age for an eastern grey. Maybe 10, maybe 12. They can live a lot longer, potentially, so they could live at least 20 years, sometimes more. But in practice, in a normal population, they don't live much beyond about 10 years on average. And that's talking about the ones that get big enough to actually have a skull that's large enough for you to find. These little guys, the pouch young, have a much higher mortality in their earlier lives. So about the time when they're starting to leave the pouch, they have all sorts of things that can go wrong. They get lost, they get preyed on by foxes and dogs, they just get confused, they get cold, they get miserable, they can't eat enough, and their mortality rate is very high. So the average age might be about 10, but many have not got anywhere near that old. And we can look at that a bit more later, some of the factors involved. 3 of those factors come under the heading of disease. So I've got an assortment of things here. This gruesome or perhaps attractive purple thing, depending on your point of view, is a duodenal worm. It's called Globocephaloides. It's only about a centimetre long. It lives in the duodenum. That's the part of the small intestine just below the stomach. And most of the time, kangaroos are fine with it, but sometimes it can really take over, particularly if conditions are bad, if the kangaroos are a bit short of food, if it's cold, if it's wet, if it's an overcrowded area. This parasite then starts to burrow into the wall of the duodenum and feeds on blood. And most kangaroos can't handle that for very long. So you often get these big crashes in the population where a lot of young, particularly young kangaroos, die from this parasitic disease. Another disease we see occasionally, it's not very common in the wild, but it's quite common in captivity, is a thing called lumpy jaw. And you can see this huge growth of bone here, which produces a big bony lump, but it also has an abscess associated with it. It's a bacterial infection. Normally a jaw would follow a line like about there. So this is all extra bone that the poor kangaroo has produced as it's trying to fight off this disease. It's generally fatal, but they can actually carry it and live with it for quite a few years sometimes. An extremely nasty and unpleasant disease. And another one that's been quite common in Nillumbik and adjacent shires in the last couple of years is Phalaris staggers. So this is the Phalaris aquatica, the canary grass, various other names. A plant like this is no big problem. It's the young growth, which often comes up before anything else because it's a perennial grass. And particularly, again, if things are a bit tough, where there's not much else food around, not much other food around, the kangaroos will eat this and then start to develop neurological symptoms. So they become very uncoordinated. They struggle to move around. They often bump into things. They have accidents. And this is a progressive disease. They can't recover from it. They can live with it if it's mild, but it continues to get worse and worse if they keep eating Phalaris. So there are a whole lot of other things in the way of disease that can happen to kangaroos, but these are three that we see fairly regularly around Melbourne. And the other big one, a major cause of mortality, is roadkill. This is a map of Anglesea where we've done a lot of work, and we've been, I think, fair enough to say, staggered at the level of roadkill in this population. It's an urban population. I'll just take you through the geography of it. This ugly scar over here is the Alcoa coal mine, which is recently closed down. The green patch here is the Anglesea golf course, where most of our work has been done and where most of the kangaroos hang out. And each of these dots is a tagged kangaroo that we've originally caught on the golf course and has been hit and killed, not necessarily outright, by a car around the town. The red ones are the females, and you can see they've mostly been killed close to the golf course, one over here a little bit further away, but many of them along this road where they just hop across the road into adjacent house blocks and then back to the golf course. So they're really at risk along some of these hot spots. Another one here. And you can see with the blue ones, these are the males, they're much more widespread. They're in fact all over the town, and this can happen particularly in winter and autumn, so about this time of year. And we were staggered, as I said. It turns out that half of the males that we have collared and tagged have been killed on the roads around the town. And of course we know that because as soon as people see the tagged animal, they tell us straight away. So it's an extraordinarily high mortality rate. And always certainly a big issue in Nillumbik and other shires around the fringes of Melbourne. So it's a very major source of mortality. So we'll go back to our equation, and we've covered fairly quickly the births and deaths, so we'll grade those out now, and we'll have a look at immigration and emigration and say a few things about that. The first point to make about eastern greys is most of them don't go very far at all. And the area that they spend their life in we call their home range. You're probably familiar with that term. And these are some female eastern greys that we tagged and radio tracked over at Yan Yean, which is just outside the Shire. This is the western boundary running along here, this red line. You can see a bit of the water body of the reservoir itself. And this part out here is the catchment, which is closed to the public, supposedly. Lots of people sneak in there to fish and hunt and do various illegal things. but it's also a fantastic place for kangaroos because it's got a lot of really good resources. And you can see from these home range maps that these kangaroos are basically commuters. So if we have a look at this green one, that was Tegan. She spends almost exactly half her life inside the catchment in this forested area, and she does that during the day. She's in there in shelter, out of sight, and she spends the day in there. If it's winter, she's out of the rain, out of the wind. If it's summer, she's in the shade. But at night, she comes out onto these adjacent farming properties. There's a number of holes in the fence that she goes through, and she spends the other half of her 24 hours out here. Very similar pattern with, where are we, Kaya, this pale blue one. She's got a bigger range, but again, about exactly half of her time inside the catchment and the other half ranging out across these paddocks, which are mostly cattle properties. And the third one, Yaki, this yellow one, again, a very similar pattern. Half the time she's inside the catchment, tucked away safely. The other half of the time she's out in the open, in the paddocks. The only one that didn't follow that pattern is Michaela here, the orangey brown one, who didn't ever go outside. She ranged along the fence, and the fence along there had a number of holes in it. But for whatever reason, she would not go through those holes. She stayed inside the catchment. And we were a bit puzzled by this for a while, but when you look at it, she's actually got the same mixture of cover and open foraging grassy areas inside her little range. So she's probably got everything she needs and probably uses them much the same way. Now this tracking went on for over a year, but I would bet if you measured those same animals 10 years later, they'd be doing pretty much the same thing. So the message is that most of the time, eastern grey kangaroos don't move very much at all. They've got a nice home range, which they've probably grown up in. They have figured it out very well. They know where all the resources are, and they simply go backwards and forwards between food and cover to get everything they need. But there are some exceptions. And the big exception is what we call dispersal. And this is something that happens usually just once in an animal's life when it leaves the area that it was born in, or in this case, left the pouch from the mother, and makes a long-scale, long-distance movement to somewhere else and then settles down somewhere else. So this one has come into Nillumbik. This was Nelson, a young male. We tagged him, caught him over here, put a radio collar on him, and he was there up until July 1995. And then one day he vanished. And it actually took us a very long time to find him. We had a bit of a hint where he'd gone because he stopped off in here for a while, but then we lost him again. We actually had to get up into Kinglake National Park, up into the lookout there, and we got the faintest of faintest radio signals, which pointed us down in this direction. And we spent a lot of time driving around people's property and up and down the roads, and we finally found him down towards the bottom of Bald Spur Road near Rankins Road here in May the year after. Now we've drawn that as a straight line. That's about 15 kilometres. It's highly unlikely that he went in a straight line. In fact, we know he didn't. He spent some time up in here, as I said, but who knows where he was in between time. We didn't have a satellite collar on him, so we couldn't monitor him every half an hour or so. It was just a matter of getting a weak radio signal and finally tracking him down. But he showed classic dispersal. So he was brought up here, spent the early 6 months or so of his life out of the pouch there, and then one day just up and left, and then settled down here and became a part of a completely new population. In between, there's no kangaroos at all in play. Well, some there are in parts, but other parts there's no roos. So he has set up essentially a new home in a new population. So he would be considered as an emigrant from the Yan Yin population, if you want to draw a line around that one, and an immigrant into this population over here. So that's the breakdown. We've looked at births and deaths quickly, and we've looked at immigration and emigration. I want to put all those together now and just have a look at how these factors come together and what sort of patterns we get in real populations, and just see what sort of dynamics occur. So I'll start with this one, because I think it's a rather sad one. This is Sunshine Coast Uni, and you can see some students over here allegedly working. One does have a laptop, so maybe she's doing something useful, but I think they're basically just soaking up the Queensland sun, and so are the kangaroos. And in fact, Sunshine Coast Uni used the kangaroos in all of their marketing. They would say things like, you know, come and study with the kangaroos. And it was a very important part of their, a very important symbol of the place. And a PhD student started a project on it, and a number of other people followed it on. And they were monitoring the population through time. This figure is called minimum known to be alive, but you can think of it as more or less an abundance figure. And each of those dots shows the annual survey result. And you can see a very alarming trend through time, and that population is now considered extinct. So it's gone from a draw card for the university advertising to no kangaroos whatsoever. And the main reason has been roadkill. Almost all of the change has been due to roadkill. The campus has been increasingly surrounded by housing and some very large and very busy roads carrying a lot of traffic, and more kangaroos have died on the road. And as I said, it is now extinct completely. A happier story is Anglesea, where we've been doing a lot of survey work, as I said. This shows the 10-year survey history that we've got. The grey, appropriately grey columns are the winter counts, and the nice bright pale ones are the summer counts, and you can see that the summer counts are always higher than the winter counts, but you can also see that both sets of counts are steadily tracking upwards. A few ups and downs, but it works out to about a 9% increase per year. So this population is doing well, despite all those roadkills I mentioned. Very high rate of roadkill, but the population is compensating for that with lots of births, and this population continues to track upwards. Serendip is a less happy story. This is a sanctuary out near Lara, towards Geelong. It had a steady rate of increase from 1995 up into 2006, until eventually it got to the point, you can see how many there were in this photo. A couple of months later, there were just as many kangaroos in that paddock, but no food whatsoever. And the population then crashed. Parks Victoria also culled the population, but about half of them had died by that stage anyway. And since then, it's bounced around, but it hasn't been allowed to get to that high level again. But a very severe crash in that population. And the final one, and I put this one in because it's the record holder for the most rapid rate of increase, and we've all been hearing about doubling times and rates of increase with COVID-19. This is Government House in Canberra, and back in 1983, the Governor-General at the time, and I've forgotten who it was now, but he or she thought it would be a rather nice idea to put some kangaroos in the gardens around Government House. And it did seem like a good idea at the time, but of course the kangaroos increased, and you can see the exponential increase here. That was the last survey in 1993. The rate of increase calculates out to doubling every 1.5 years. And that is, as I say, the record holder. And no other kangaroo population has been found to grow so fast. And of course, it couldn't keep going indefinitely. So in 1994, before it got to this point, there was a combination of a cull, a translocation, and a fertility control program. So the numbers were brought down by the culling program and the translocation, and the fertility control kept the numbers down after that. But it was, as I say, going up at an amazing rate. Okay, so I wanted to look now at how we deal with these ideas in terms of management. And again, we'll just have a look at half of this equation and see what we can do about births and deaths. And really, we're using these parts of the equation to manipulate a population either upwards or downwards, depending on what we want to do with it. So one way to deal with population growth, as I just mentioned with Government House, is a contraception program or fertility control program. And here is my colleague Michelle inserting contraceptive implants into an eastern grey kangaroo female. This is at a site that doesn't have an overpopulation problem yet, but the managers were concerned that the rate of increase meant that they might have one very soon. So they were very keen to intervene early and treat these females, not all of them, but a large proportion of them, so that the population wouldn't go through the roof. And this technique works very well. You can have a look down the bottom here. Guess who's had the implant and who hasn't. The implant is very successful, and it will stop females breeding for 7 years or more, and potentially the rest of their lives. But it also has the advantage of being reversible, so you can allow the females to breed again. The disadvantage is that you have to catch them and anaesthetise them and put them on an operating table and have all of your surgical equipment to make just a little incision and then put the implants in and then sew it up again. But we've never had any problems with infection or any of that sort of thing. So it's a very safe technique, but rather labour intensive, as you can see. In the ACT, there's some colleagues here are working on a new technique, which is a vaccine, which vaccinates the kangaroo against their own reproductive hormone. And the big advantage of this is that it can be done as an injection and potentially even as a remote injection using a dart gun, so that you don't have to catch the kangaroos. You can just inject them from a distance, and they will then hopefully have lifetime contraception. This particular trial, these animals were caught and injected by hand because they wanted to know exactly what the effects were before they went further down the path of remote injection, but the potential is quite promising. So that's being monitored, and at the moment I think they're up to about 5 years of contraceptive effect, which is good. The other one, which is the last resort, of course, is culling. And I know it raises some very strong emotions. Nobody likes it, but there are times when it has to be done, particularly if all else has failed. But the goal is always not to get to that point if you can. And then I'll just finish off by looking at the potential for manipulating immigration and emigration. So there's two movement parts of the equation, and see what we can do about those. And here, there really is some simple, not exactly cheap, but low-tech and very effective techniques available. And exclusion fencing is by far the most effective way of dealing with a kangaroo problem if you have a high-value item that you're wishing to protect, whether it's crops or pasture or other things. This fence is a pretty solid fence, as you can see. It's a type of deer wire. All of this is roo traffic. There are no stock in this paddock. So these are the roos that are pacing up and down, would like to get into this next property, but the landholder has fenced them out. It's very difficult to make a kangaroo-proof fence completely kangaroo-proof. Some will get over, and many of you will know that they'll also push under. This one has got a netting skirt, but it's still a matter of doing regular maintenance. And as I say, if what's on the other side of the fence is of value enough, then this is a very good way to keep kangaroos out. It's also a very good way to keep them off roads, but again, an expensive thing to build and maintain. And then finally, there's been quite a lot of thinking and a bit of experimentation about the possibility of removing kangaroos. So this is getting them to emigrate from an area you don't want them into somewhere else, using an assortment of designs of one-way gates. So here's my colleague Claire just trying out this very simple one-way gate. It's just a hinged gate which will only open one way. The kangaroos very quickly learn to push it up, and you can help them do that by propping it up on a bit of a stick or something until they learn to open it, and they'll push through it and get through to the other side, and theoretically won't be able to get back again. Some of them, however, are smart enough to get their hands in behind the little gate and to open it up and get back through. But there are a number of nifty designs being tested at the moment using what's called a spear gate design, which has been used a lot for goats, self-mustering systems for goats in the rangelands. And they look as though they will be more successful. They're easier for the kangaroo to work out how to get through, and they're much harder for them to figure out how to get back. They're almost impossible to go backwards through. So this could be a means of removing kangaroos from areas you don't want them, just by either allowing them to do it through their own natural movements, or to perhaps give them a bit of a push out the other side with perhaps something like a sweep count type of design with a group of people to move them along. But you'd have to be careful with that because there's a lot of hard objects to bump into with a fence. So I think I'll pretty much wind it up at that point. There's a lot of different things we've covered, and as I said, a whole lot of things that I haven't been able to cover. So perhaps I'll hand back over to Julia. Turn that off, and there we go. Yes.
Thank you so much, Graeme. As you were presenting, I was having a lot of technical issues, so I'm on a second computer and setting that up, and at the same time trying to get all the questions that are being asked as well. So I'll have to say a very big thank you to Meg, who's been going through all of those while I've been trying dramatically in the background, not stuffing things up.
I'm glad I couldn't hear it.
Yeah. So we've got a number of questions, and as I said at the start, we won't get through all of them, but we'll try and get through as many as we can. And I'll start with the first one. And thank you to everyone who have been submitting those questions as well. They've been really interesting. So the first one is, shooters tend to target the large alpha males, and they are being taken out of the roo populations. So we are now seeing much smaller males taking on the top male role in breeding. So human intervention is changing the kangaroo gene pool and therefore their overall biology. And is there any research being done on this?
Okay, well, I'll start with a bit of a cop-out by saying that I'm not a geneticist, so I can't give you a direct genetic answer. But I can say a couple of things. First of all, we know from the genetic work that's been done, and we've been involved in some of that, that it's not just the large alpha males that sire the young in a population. That's the general view about how things work. But in fact, in 2 studies now, we've shown, and other people have shown, that many of the males actually are fathers in the system. The larger ones do tend to sire more, but even young males as light as about 30 kilos in body weight, which is easily half the size of the alphas, have managed to sire young. And that applies at Anglesea in particular, and also down at Wilson's Prom. So in a way, the question is assuming something that isn't necessarily completely the case. But as I said, the larger males probably do sire more of the young. So the question then is, what happens if you take them out of the system, and what does that do to the genetics? And that's the bit that I can't answer. But I can tell you that other people are working on it, and it'll take a while before we know the answers to that. But those tagged kangaroos I showed you, like Marilyn and her son, we know how many young Marilyn has had. We know who each of their fathers have been, and we will know ultimately what happens to the offspring and how many young they produce as well. So that information takes a very long time to accumulate, but it is being worked on.
Great, thank you. The second question is, you mentioned Phalaris staggers. What programs are you aware of that oh, sorry, hang on, that question's just disappeared.
I can't see that one.
Yes, hang on, there it is. What programs are you aware of that are dealing with this? And especially because in Plenty Gorge, we are aware of the Phalaris toxicity that's occurring there.
Yeah, well, I believe that Parks Vic are planning, I'm not sure how far they've got, but they're certainly planning a trial of a cobalt additive. The theory is that cobalt will either counteract the effect of the Phalaris toxin in the body, or may be incorporated by the plant, and it may produce less of the toxin in the first place. I can't remember which way it works, but they do intend to do a trial. They might have started, I'm not sure. They were trying to work out suitable sites and trying to get the experimental design right so that they could show that they were making a difference. For example, one of the things they had to make sure was that roos who were feeding in the treated area weren't also going to go and feed in an untreated area. So they had to make sure the areas were far enough apart so that kangaroos would either get the treatment or not get the treatment, so that act as a control, so you'd be able to tell whether there's a difference. No one knows how much cobalt is the right amount, if it does work, and even how often it has to be delivered, how you best provide it. There's been a suggestion of putting it in licks so that the kangaroos would consume the cobalt directly. That's how it works for sheep, but it's very hard to find things that kangaroos will actually like to eat out from grass. The other solution is to try to change the composition of the grasslands in Plenty Gorge, and a lot of that is to do with getting tangled up. It's to do with the grazing regime. So the goal is not to allow the grass level to get down so low that the kangaroos only have Phalaris to feed on. So perhaps species replacement. Obviously, we'd prefer to have native species in there anyway. So that'll be the long-term solution. But in the meantime, there are a lot of kangaroos suffering quite badly, and hopefully it won't happen again next year, but certainly last year was really bad. But a lot does depend on
thanks, Graeme.
The rain has helped a lot too.
Yes, yeah, definitely. Yeah, I was going to mention as well, increasing the diversity of Indigenous grasses in the area would be a good way.
It's a bit of an irony, really, because Phalaris was originally proposed by the soil conservation people as a way of reducing erosion. It's also quite good stock food as well, but it's no good for kangaroos, and it's no good for sheep or cattle at the wrong time of year either. So I think longer term replacement would be best.
Yeah, great, thank you. The third question, can you tell us what causes blindness in kangaroos and wallabies?
Yep, there's a virus. It's an orbivirus, it's called. It's one that has an insect vector. It's vectored by little midges, and the midges breed in mud. So the worst outbreaks have occurred up in the dry country, the semi-arid rangelands country. After a wet year, you then get a lot of floodwaters that dry up, and the mud from all of those flooded areas is just perfect for the midge. The midge then breeds up, they bite the kangaroos and they transmit the virus. So the virus is always there, but it's only when the conditions are right. And about 15 years ago, we had a huge outbreak of the orbivirus, and it came all the way down to Victoria. So it was quite severe. There are other reasons other things that'll cause blindness, but that's the one that causes these big epidemics, which happen episodically, just from time to time, all tied in with rainfall.
Thanks. There's a question, Graeme, on lumpy jaw disease, which someone has suggested is an infection that can be treated if it's caught early. So they're asking whether or not you can tell us more detail why you call it a disease and how does the disease occur and develop?
Yep, well, might be partly definitions, but disease is any form of ill health, so it's not necessarily infectious. It can be caused by bacteria, by viruses, by chemicals in the environment. It's anything that is ill health in an animal. But this particular one is caused by a bacterium which is everywhere. It's an anaerobic bacterium that lives in the soil, and it's always around. So it's always potentially going to infect a kangaroo, but whether it infects or not depends on a few factors that aren't very well understood. The things that tend to go along with it are dry conditions, poor food conditions, so very hard, spiky sort of food. So where a kangaroo might have run out of nice green grass and is then forced to eat dry stems or even things like thistles and so on. Overcrowding, I mentioned, and that's probably, again, related to the availability of food, but it might also mean that the kangaroo is not in very good body condition in the first place. And taken together, those things are the situation where you get these outbreaks of lumpy jaw. The question's right, it can be treated. It's always treated in a captive situation, or almost always, if you can get it early. Treatment can be fairly drastic. Sometimes you have to extract teeth. Sometimes you have to clean up bits of bone, but antibiotics will deal with it. But it is difficult because it grows in the bone well away from the surface of the skin, because it grows without oxygen. So you have to get your treatment into the source of the infection, which can quite often be right at the roots of the teeth or deep in the bone. So as I say, it can be rather drastic treatment. The solution is to make sure the food is available, abundant, soft, and that you don't have constant reinfection of the soil with a heavy load of fecal contamination as well, so that you're not continually loading the animal up with more and more of this bacterium. So in captivity, the usual solution is to reduce the number of animals. Don't have such a high stocking rate in your enclosure. Don't let them get too crowded. Hope that helps. But I'm not a vet, so I'm talking vet things that I probably shouldn't.
We've got another question here. Are roo scaring posts, the ones that make the noises on the sides of the roads, worthwhile preventing roadkill? I'm not sure if that's a question you can answer, Graeme, but
well, it's a
we
question
get a lot of that. So
yeah, it's a question I can't answer for a very good reason. That is that we don't have good enough experiments to be able to answer it. So that's a rather slippery answer. But I'll answer it two ways. First of all, there has never been a deterrent device that uses sound and light that has worked on wildlife over the long term. And it doesn't matter whether you're talking about roads or trying to protect pasture or keep possums out of your yard or whatever it is. Wildlife will always adapt to things. They'll habituate, we call it. They'll just get used to things. So it gives them a fright at first. There's a novelty effect. And then after a while, if there's an incentive, they'll come back and they'll get over it. And you can see this, in extreme situations at the end of a runway, when a jet's producing goodness knows how many decibels of full throttle roar, and you'll see something like a magpie or a a mudlark or something feeding as if there was nothing going on. They've adapted. And the same things happen with these sort of scaring devices. Now, there's some information from Tasmania that looks as though it does have an effect, at least in the short term, but there's another study in Tasmania that says that it doesn't. And we really need better studies to see what the limitations are. And the studies have to be more than, let's put out a bunch of these and see whether the number of kangaroos changes. Because they've just been doing a study down on Phillip Island, for example. Swamp wallabies are the animal that they're concerned about down there. 1 or 2 swamp wallabies die every day on the islands, on the roads in Phillip Island. It's a really high rate of mortality. It's very, very unfortunate. So they've set up a line of these devices which make loud noises and bright lights. And last year they had the control year, so they didn't turn them on. This year they've turned them on. But what else has happened this year? COVID. So nobody's going down to Phillip Island. The traffic has dropped, and of course the number of roadkill are going to fall. So it's not going to give us the answer. So it's really challenging to design something that both tries to deal with the problem, but also gives you good information at the same time. But my gut feeling is that they're not going to work because of that problem of habituation. They don't make the right sound as well. We know that the sound is at the wrong frequency, and one of the 2 coloured lights probably kangaroos can't see. So we don't think they're very well targeted at the animals anyway. So I'm pretty sceptical.
Yeah, thank you.
Right.
There's another very interesting question. Wallaroos.
Wallaroos.
Yes.
Where's that one? Oh yes, I see it.
At the top there. So are you aware that the Australian Museum was shooting wallaroos at Yan Yan in 1960? That's an interesting one. I don't know wallaroos. You'll have to explain, Graeme.
Well, yeah, wallaroos come in 2 forms. There's the eastern wallaroo, which lives down the eastern ranges on the east coast, and the western form is called the Euro, lives out in the arid zone, and they're the same species, just 2 subspecies. What they have in common is that they really like hilly areas. But the question's not correct. The animals at Yan Yan in the 1960s were all eastern greys. I've seen them all, seen all their skulls. That collection is half in the Australian Museum and half in the Museum of Victoria, and they were all eastern greys. So they're certainly not wallaroos, but there are wallaroos in far east Gippsland. There's just a tiny little area of Victoria that has eastern wallaroos, and as far as we know, that's where they've always been, and they probably haven't expanded or contracted. We're right on the edge of their preferred habitat, pretty much.
Thank you for that.
Right.
The next question may or may not have been answered earlier, but has there been any research done on the impacts of shooting on the societal of kangaroos?
Yes, where are we?
Question from Nadine.
Oh yes, I've got it. Yep. Impact of shooting on this. Yeah, it's a similar question to what we had before, except this is broader, because it involves the females as well. The social structure of kangaroos is hard to describe because it's not a neat structure. It's a very fluid society. It's often called a fission fusion society. So if you look at a group of kangaroos, you'll see that there's constant coming and going between the group. So individuals will leave a group and join a group, but they do also have associates that they hang out with more often than average. So if you pick kangaroo X, there's a pretty good chance you'll be able to predict who else it might be with on a given day. You might get some surprises, might be somebody completely unexpected, but there will be associates with who they hang out with more often than not. Now, those associates aren't necessarily relatives. They are a little bit more likely to hang out with relatives, but often the associates aren't related to them. And there is one study from southern Queensland. It wasn't a study about shooting, it was a study about dingoes. They had a group of kangaroos. It was a whole mob that they knew really well by sight. They didn't have tags on them, they just recognised them from their facial features and nicks in their ears and dark patches on their bodies, and they had a whole photo record of them so they could look up who was who. And they'd just really got going on that project. I forget how many kangaroos there were, maybe 40 or 50 that they knew really well. And a small group of dingoes arrived, small pack of dingoes arrived, and killed about half the kangaroos in a very short time. And it took out a number of individuals who had associates who were then lost without them for a while. So it changed the interactions between them. I'm trying to remember some of the details. It certainly disrupted the structure of the group. So they lost their regular associates, and I think they spent a lot more time vigilant, looking out for predators, but that wouldn't be a big surprise because they'll be worried about dingoes anyway. No, I'm sorry, I've forgotten that there is a key detail that I just can't remember. But the general answer is that it did disrupt the social pattern quite dramatically. And there was a lot of readjustment as they then associated with other individuals they hadn't previously associated with before. But one of the key messages was that they will still associate. That kangaroos really are gregarious animals. They want and like to be with other kangaroos. So if they've lost their long-term associate, then they will certainly join with others to be with another kangaroo. That was a rather long, garbled answer. I don't think I really covered it very well, but it's the best I could do.
No, that was good. Thanks, Graeme. There's another interesting question about, have you done any research on the integration and or survival of hand-reared orphan roos into established populations, or those that are translocated for whatever reason?
No, I haven't, but there has been a bit done on that. One study in New South Wales monitored, I think, at least 20 orphans, and their survival was very good, and they appeared to integrate with the neighbouring mob of maroons quite well. So there was no aggressive interactions towards them, and that fits exactly with what I was saying before. They are very accepting animals. They're not territorial. They don't reject other animals from the mob. They will accept new kangaroos pretty happily. So that was quite encouraging. Translocation is a different story. We know a lot less about that. But one thing we do know is that the mortality rate after translocation, if you're translocating adults, is very high. And the reasons for that aren't completely clear, but it's partly to do with the stress of capture and partly to do with the stress of being taken to somewhere completely new. And as an adult, and I showed you those home ranges from Yan Yan before, they are they're stuck in their ways. They like routine, and if you pick up a kangaroo and take it somewhere completely different, it isn't necessarily going to stay there. It may try to come back. There's some evidence of that, and they will cross roads and they'll get tangled up in fences. They'll find themselves in places that are just totally unfamiliar, and things will go wrong.
Wow. There's a lot more questions, so I'll try not to bombard you with too many, but we'll try and get through as many as we can.
Yep.
The University of Newcastle has recently used drones to count koala populations in the Tilbury habitat. Have you had any experience using drones or similar technology in counting macropods?
I haven't yet, but there's some work going on with that. In fact, that Queensland University I mentioned, where the kangaroos all disappeared, they've been doing some work on drones, and the ACT are doing some work on drones as well. The potential is pretty big. One of the big advantages is that they can be used with thermal cameras on them, so that you're not just taking visual images, but you can use thermal imaging as well. And if kangaroos are the only animals in your study area, then that makes it easy. If not, then you've got to try and work out the thermal signature of kangaroos versus, say, a swamp wallaby or a sheep. And if you're close enough, that's okay. But if you're just at a distance, you'll just get these little bright spots that will be difficult to distinguish. So there's all those sort of questions that have to be worked out, plus the ethics of the flight speed, the noise, the height above the animals. All of those sort of questions are still being thought about and being tested. But obviously the goal is to fly at a height that doesn't disturb the animals, but is low enough so that you get good coverage and you can tell what's what. The other advantage of the thermal imaging is that you can potentially see through the canopy of trees, so that you'll be able to survey thicker bush than you would during daylight hours. So yes, it's coming, but there are still a lot of limitations, and there are a lot of regulations around drones as well. And I probably should mention urban surveys. One of the first things we wanted to do down in Anglesea was to figure out how many kangaroos were in the whole town, not just on the golf course. And we had to give it up because it's just too difficult to get people's approval. I mean, why would you want somebody flying a drone over your backyard when you're sunbaking or reading a book or something? And you can't do things like transects. You can't have people tromping along on straight lines up and over fences and through people's yards and into their pool. So it's those sort of areas are a real challenge. And I think somewhere, a municipality like Nillumbik has all of those mixed land uses, and I think it would be quite tricky. But a small area is something that a drone operator can use. You have to have line of sight at the moment. You can't let the drone out of your vision. So there's a limitation there. And there's also things like power lines and so on to think about too, not to mention air traffic and a whole lot of other regulations. So yes,
and I can imagine that it'd be quite disturbing to some birds and
that's right. You've got to think about all those non-target effects too.
Exactly.
But they're being used for water bird surveys in a number of places, and breeding bird surveys on seabird islands and places like that. They're quite good for that. They're also being used for whales, so you can fly them over things like the southern right whales down at Warrnambool, and the whales don't care in the slightest.
Incredible.
Yeah.
There's another question here. It's quite interesting. Not strictly seasonal breeding like Tamar wallabies, eastern grey kangaroos do have peaks in summer. Is this breeding synchronicity, if I said that right? Synchronicity, driven by change in day length, and hence could have impacts via light pollution in a similar fashion as seasonal breeding species? Are there shifts in reproductive peaks in more urban populations compared to rural populations?
I think I know who this person is. And I can answer it quite easily by saying we don't know. The peaks are nowhere near as synchronous as they are in the Tamar wallaby, as you saw from that graph. And we really don't know why a female might breed earlier than another one or might breed later. The results from one study show that in one particular year, breeding a little bit earlier was an advantage. In another year, breeding a little bit later was an advantage. In 2 other years, breeding right in the middle where the peak was an advantage. So I think it's really an answer about Australia and the climatic variability that we have here. Even down south where we think it's a fairly predictable environment, it's not that predictable. And for a species like an eastern grey, they can't really predict in inverted commas how things are going to work out. what is nearly a year later, which is the time when the young are leaving their pouch and starting to feed on solid food a lot. But the general idea is that by breeding when they do, by giving birth when they do, those young are coming out at a time when in an average year there would be a flush of spring growth and there'd be a lot more food to go around. But yes, as I say, not every year works out like that. So sometimes it works nicely and sometimes it doesn't. The big thing about being an Eastern Grey is you're going to live a long time, and if this year doesn't work, then you can have another go next year. And you just take your chances, I guess.
Yeah. So I guess following on from that, how would you think climate change would impact on...
Oh yes, there was a question about climate change. Yeah. That was the other half of that. Good question. One thing we do know is the further south you go with Eastern Greys, the later the birth peak is. So around places like Canberra, it's pretty much about Christmas. And in Tasmania, it's in February. So that suggests that there is something about growth period and peak of growth that is driving this. And those peaks may well move with climate change. Which way they move is anybody's guess. And the other possibility is it'll simply become more variable, as a lot of the modelling shows. So it could even be that the current selection to keep your breeding within a few months, not too far apart, might break down even further, and it becomes so unpredictable that you could breed almost any time of year and have an equally good chance of raising or not raising a young. So totally speculative there, but yeah, I guess we don't know. That's a good question.
It is the great unknown at the moment, isn't it? I've just got a question here. You talked about how kangaroos love their forests and some never leave their forest. Oh, hang on. Sorry, am I still signed in?
I've got you.
Yep, oh good.
Yep.
Sorry, Zoom was trying to sign me out for some reason. What do you think the effect of broad-scale clearing and farming has been on kangaroos, which have been described as forest and woodland species?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's very much a question of scale. So broad scale is the key there. In the early days of settlement, we did things that really benefited kangaroos. So small, patchy clearing where people would start to cut down some forest and woodland to make some pasture for their small flocks of sheep and cattle would have been just very nice, thank you, for a kangaroo, because there was still cover. So there would be remnant native vegetation, trees and shrubs, and there was increased pasture as well. So they could do that commute and they could do it on a very small scale. But when clearing becomes large, wholesale, broad scale, then you've created an area that has no cover. And Eastern Greys simply can't persist in that sort of environment. And we can see that now in places like the Wimmera, where there's the only trees that are left are in a few tiny reserves and in roadside remnants. And you can drive and survey from the air as well for hours and hours across the Wimmera, and you simply won't see any kangaroos. So that's what happens when you go too far down that process. Equally, an area that was predominantly forest with very little in the way of grassy clearings isn't terribly good for a kangaroo either. So they really do like that patchy black and white type of environment, which has got the cover adjacent to foraging areas. A nice broken up sort of environment is ideal for them. If you want to design one, you'd make a golf course. That's the way to do it. And that's why kangaroos love golf courses. So it's just the perfect combination of food and cover.
Yes, they're very common on golf courses.
Yes.
How do you determine that a population is too large?
Well, there is no such thing as too large. It depends entirely on your management goals. and that assumes you can reach some agreement on your management goals. If your goal is to have a viewing area for people to see kangaroos, then lots of kangaroos is a good thing. So I've talked about Anglesea a number of times. They've been running tours, kangaroo tours, and their main market up until recently has been Chinese tourists who pay quite a lot of money to go around in a buggy with a guide, and they're taken to the kangaroos. They're given a bit of information. They're given lots of photo opportunities, and clearly a place like that wants lots of kangaroos. If you are concerned about native vegetation and you're managing a reserve for rare plants, perhaps, then even a few kangaroos might be too many. So it all comes down to what is the management purpose for the area that you're talking about. And that's partly why I was at pains to talk about what is a population. You're talking about a particular place always, and that place will have a designated purpose usually, or it's in the process of developing one in some cases, and kangaroos might be a good thing for that, or there might be a not so good thing.
Yes, as a botanist, Graeme, kangaroos have always been an interesting thing to try and manage, especially with threatened orchids. So yeah,
orchids are a
you're
hard
definitely
one.
right.
But you'll also know that if you're talking about things like ephemeral grasslands, that they need biomass control. They need removal of the bulk of vegetation at intervals, and grazing is one way, fire is another, and you know. Of course, what's missing in all this is the predator. We've got a system now where the car is the main predator in the peri-urban areas. Previously, the main control had been hunting by Aboriginal people and predation by dingoes.
Yes, yeah. I'm just going to ask maybe one or two more questions because we should probably wrap up. It's after 9 o'clock. Given that roos are nomadic and move around, do you sweep count over different times and compare the same sites over different times?
One of the things I wanted to get across was that they're not nomadic. They do have these pretty small ranges, with the exception of the occasional dispersing individual, but they certainly won't be in the same place today as they were yesterday necessarily. So the sweep counts really only work if you can cover the whole area where the kangaroos might be. So I mentioned islands, so they're either on the island or they're not, or a reserve that has a fence around it, or a nice sharp boundary might have pasture all the way around it. So you could have somebody stationed along the edges so that if some kangaroos leave the reserve while your sweep count's going on, you can count those as well. But yeah, clearly if it's too big an area, the question of kangaroos coming and going is going to completely stuff up the sweep count. So you can only use it in fairly limited situations.
And I think I'm just going to ask you one final question, because this is something that I'm interested in as well. So it's a bit selfish. Do kangaroos self-regulate their population? And if so, under what circumstances? And I think you've talked about that, but
yeah, a little bit, but not fully.
Not much. Yeah.
I think, well, self-regulations, it depends how you look at it, really. We don't believe that they take a look around themselves and the conditions and say, it's not too good, I think I won't breed this year. It's not at that conscious level. It seems to be controlled by their body condition. And this is where it gets complicated, because kangaroos are what we call continuous growers. So they actually get bigger every year. So a female kangaroo will grow larger and larger all the way through her life. Her legs will her bones become longer, she'll weigh a little bit more, and she's got then what's called a maintenance requirement to meet, because she's simply going to need food to maintain that growth as she gets older. And then on top of that maintenance, she's got the option of breeding or not breeding. So if conditions are good, she's got enough food coming in to meet both of those demands. She can satisfy her maintenance needs and keep getting bigger, without having to use up muscle tissue or any drastic measures like that. And she's got excess that she can put into her young. So in cases like that, females will breed, and the breeding rate is usually pretty high. So 90% or more of females will breed in 1 year in a population. If conditions turn bad, either through external factors like drought or through population factors like having a lot of competitors, a lot of kangaroos around you, all eating the same food, then she's going to have trouble meeting those two requirements. Now, she can't stop growing. So if she does, she'll basically just frizzle up and die. So the thing that has to give is the young. So she's got the option of breeding or not breeding. It's still not as simple as that, because to produce one of those tiny little beans, the really small baby kangaroos, doesn't require much effort anyway. So she might make a start, and then the question is, can she produce enough milk to sustain it? And if she can't, the milk will dry up and it'll die. So the regulation does happen, but it's driven by these external factors that determine how much food the mum has to actually breed and continue to keep the young alive and get it through to the end of the pouch life. And even then, after it's left the pouch, she continues to suckle it outside the pouch, and it has to get through to about 18 months old before it's able to actually fend for itself completely. So it's a big investment. And whether she can do it for that length of time without something not working is depends on those external factors. Make sense? It does also depend on her age. So the older the female, the better they are at it as well. So the younger ones will struggle more. And it's partly because they're actually trying to grow faster at that stage themselves. So they're competing with their own youngster, in a sense.
Wow, it's incredible.
Yeah.
Well, I think on that very interesting note, Graeme, we might leave it there. Unfortunately, we still have about 70 odd questions that we just
Right.
haven't had a chance to get around to. So I'm,
Right.
I'm very, very sorry about that to everyone that have asked those questions. I think we've done the best we can. But Graeme, I'd just like to say a very, very big thank you for doing this webinar tonight and giving us some amazing information on one of our most common species that, you know, we don't really focus on very much. So
Yeah, right.
yeah, really, really appreciate it. And I'm sure everyone listening tonight is going to go away with much more knowledge than what they had before.
Well, thanks for the opportunity, and thanks for listening, everybody, and thanks for all those questions. I will go through them later, but I'm not going to have time to answer them all, I'm afraid. So, yeah.
And I'll just let everyone know as well that tonight's webinar was recorded. So Nillumbik will share that with all the participants and with the broader community as well. So thank you. Thank you once again.
Right.
See you later.
See ya.